Once peace was made and the club's work finished, I started thinking again about setting up an academy. First, I got a bunch of energetic friends involved in the plan, many of whom were from the junto. Next, I wrote and put out a pamphlet called Title Missing in Original. I gave these out for free to the main residents. As soon as I figured they had read it and were a bit ready, I started a fundraiser to open and support an academy. People would pay in installments every year for 5 years. I thought splitting it up like that would encourage bigger donations, and I think it did, totaling at least £5,000 if I recall correctly. In the introduction to these proposals, I said they were published by some group, not by me. This was my usual way of doing things, trying not to present myself to the public as the one behind any plan meant to help them.
To get the project going right away, the people who donated money chose 24 trustees from their group. They picked Mr. Francis, who was the Attorney General at the time, and me, to write up the rules for how the academy would be run. Once that was done and signed, we rented a house, hired teachers, and the schools opened, I think, in 1749. The number of students grew quickly, and the house soon became too small. We were looking for a good spot to build a new one, when, by chance, we found a large house already built that, with a few changes, would work perfectly for us.
This was the building I mentioned earlier, built by Mr. Whitefield's followers. We got it this way. It's important to know that since people from different religious groups contributed to this building, they made sure that when choosing the trustees who would own the building and land, no single group would have too much power. This was to prevent one group from eventually taking over the whole thing for themselves, which wasn't the original idea. So they appointed one person from each group, one Church of England member, one Presbyterian, one Baptist, one Moravian, and so on. If someone died, their replacement would be chosen by election from the contributors. The Moravian trustee didn't get along with his colleagues, and after he died, they decided not to have another Moravian. The problem then was how to avoid having 2 people from some other group when choosing a new trustee. Several people were suggested, but rejected for that reason. Finally, someone brought up my name, saying I was just an honest man and didn't belong to any particular religious group. This convinced them to choose me.
The excitement from when the house was first built had died down a long time ago, and its trustees hadn't been able to raise new money to pay the ground rent and other debts the building had caused, which was a big problem for them. Since I was now a trustee for both the building and the academy, I had a good chance to talk to both groups. I eventually got them to agree that the building's trustees would hand it over to the academy's trustees. In return, the academy would pay off the debt, keep a large hall in the building open forever for guest preachers as originally intended, and run a free school for poor children. The necessary documents were drawn up, and after the debts were paid, the academy's trustees took possession of the property. By dividing the big, tall hall into floors and creating different rooms upstairs and downstairs for the various schools, and buying some extra land, the whole place was soon ready for our use, and the students moved in. I was responsible for dealing with the workers, buying materials, and overseeing the construction. I did it happily because it didn't get in the way of my own business. The year before, I had taken on a very capable, hard-working, and honest partner, Mr. David Hall. I knew him well because he had worked for me for 4 years. He took over all the responsibilities of the printing office, and he always paid me my share of the profits on time. Our partnership lasted 18 years, and it was good for both of us. After some time, the Academy's trustees officially became a corporation, thanks to a charter from the governor. Their money grew with donations from Britain and land grants from the proprietors, and the Assembly has added a lot more since then. That's how the current University of Philadelphia was founded. I've been a trustee since the start, for almost 40 years now, and it's been a huge pleasure to see many young people educated there become distinguished by their improved skills, useful in public roles, and a credit to their country. When I stepped away from my private business, as I mentioned, I thought that with the decent, though not huge, amount of money I'd made, I'd have plenty of free time for the rest of my life to study philosophy and enjoy hobbies. I bought all of Dr. Spence's equipment, who had come from England to give lectures here, and I eagerly continued my experiments with electricity. But the public, now seeing me as someone with free time, started pulling me into their affairs. Almost every part of our local government, at roughly the same time, gave me some responsibility. The governor made me a justice of the peace. The city council chose me to be on the common council, and soon after, an alderman. And the general public elected me as a representative, burgess, in the assembly. I liked this last role more because I was finally tired of just sitting there listening to debates where, as a clerk, I couldn't say anything. These debates were often so boring that I'd entertain myself by drawing magic squares or circles or anything to avoid getting bored. I figured becoming a member would give me more power to do good. I won't pretend, though, that my ambition wasn't boosted by all these promotions. It definitely was. Considering where I started, these were big achievements for me, and they were even more satisfying because there were so many spontaneous signs of the public's good opinion, and I hadn't asked for any of them. I tried being a justice of the peace for a bit, going to a few courts and sitting on the bench to hear cases. But I realized I needed more knowledge of common law than I had to do that job well. So I slowly stepped back, explaining that I had to focus on my more important duties as a lawmaker in the assembly. I was re-elected to this position every year for 10 years without ever asking anyone for their vote or hinting that I wanted to be chosen. When I took my seat in the House, my son was made their clerk. The next year, a treaty was going to be held with the Indians at Carlisle. The governor sent a message to the House suggesting they pick some of their members to join some council members as commissioners for the treaty. The House chose the Speaker, Mr. Norris, and me. Once we were officially appointed, we went to Carlisle and met with the Indians. Since these people tend to get very drunk, and when they do, become very argumentative and unruly, we strictly banned selling any alcohol to them. When they complained about this rule, we told them that if they stayed sober during the treaty, we'd give them plenty of rum once everything was done. They promised they would, and they kept their promise because they couldn't get any liquor. The treaty went very smoothly and ended with everyone happy. Afterward, they asked for and received the rum. This was in the afternoon. There were about 100 men, women, and children staying in temporary cabins built in a square shape just outside the town. That evening, hearing a lot of noise from them, the commissioners went out to see what was happening. We found they had built a huge bonfire in the middle of the square. They were all drunk, men and women, arguing and fighting. Their dark-skinned, half-naked bodies, lit only by the dim light of the bonfire, chasing and hitting each other with burning sticks, along with their terrible yelling, created a scene that looked as close to our idea of hell as you can imagine. There was no way to calm the chaos, so we went back to our lodging. At midnight, a bunch of them came banging on our door, demanding more rum, but we ignored them.
The next day, realizing they had misbehaved by causing such a disturbance, they sent 3 of their old advisers to apologize. The speaker admitted their fault, but blamed it on the rum. Then he tried to excuse the rum by saying, "And really, if God's plan is to wipe out these native people to make space for farmers, it seems likely that rum might be the tool for it. It has already wiped out all the tribes who used to live along the coast." That evening, hearing a lot of noise from them, the commissioners went out to see what was happening.
In 1751, my good friend Dr. Thomas Bond came up with the idea of starting a hospital in Philadelphia. It was a really good idea, and some people have given me credit for it, but it was his original plan. The hospital would take in and treat poor sick people, whether they lived in the province or were just passing through. He was very enthusiastic and worked hard to get donations for it. But since the idea of a hospital was new in America and not well understood at first, he didn't have much luck. Eventually, he came to me and complimented me, saying he realized you couldn't get a public-spirited project done without my involvement. He said, "People I ask for donations often ask me, 'Have you joined Franklin about this? What does he think?' And when I tell them I haven't, thinking it was probably outside your usual interests, they don't donate. They just say they'll think about it." I asked him about his plan and how it would help, and he gave me a very clear explanation. Not only did I donate myself, but I also enthusiastically committed to helping him get donations from others. Before I started asking for money, though, I tried to get people ready by writing about the topic in the newspapers, which was my usual approach in such situations, but something he hadn't done. After that, donations came in more freely and generously.
But when they started to slow down, I realized we wouldn't have enough money without some help from the assembly. So I suggested we ask them for it, and we did. The representatives from the rural areas weren't keen on the project at first. They argued that it would only benefit the city, so the city residents alone should pay for it. They also doubted whether the city residents themselves generally approved of it. I argued the opposite, saying it was so popular that there was no doubt we could raise £2,000 through voluntary donations. They thought this was an outrageous idea and completely impossible. Based on this, I came up with my plan. I asked for permission to introduce a bill to officially recognize the donors, as they had requested in their petition, and to grant them a blank sum of money. I got permission mainly because the House knew they could just reject a bill if they didn't like it. I wrote the bill so that the important part was conditional. "And be it enacted by the authority aforesaid, that when the said contributors shall have met and chosen their managers and treasurer, the yearly interest of which is to be applied to the accommodating of the sick poor in the said hospital, free of charge for diet, attendance, advice, and medicines, that it shall and may be lawful for the said speaker, and he is hereby required, to sign an order on the provincial treasurer for the payment of £2,000 in 2 yearly payments to the treasurer of the said hospital, to be applied to the founding, building, and finishing of the same." This condition helped the bill pass. The members who had opposed the grant, now thinking they could get credit for being charitable without actually spending money, agreed to approve it. Then, when we were asking people for donations, we used the law's conditional promise as an extra reason to give, since everyone's donation would be doubled. So this clause worked out well in 2 ways. The donations quickly exceeded the amount we needed, and we claimed and received the public money, which allowed us to start the project. A convenient and attractive building was soon put up. The hospital has proven useful through constant experience and is still thriving today. I can't remember any of my political tricks whose success gave me more pleasure at the time, or where, looking back, I felt more justified in having used a bit of cleverness.
Around this time, another person with a project, the Reverend Gilbert Tennant, came to me asking for help to raise money for a new church. It was for a congregation he had formed among the Presbyterians, who were originally followers of Mr. Whitefield. I didn't want to annoy my fellow citizens by constantly asking them for donations, so I flat out refused. He then asked if I would give him a list of people I knew were generous and cared about the community. I thought it would be wrong of me, after they had so kindly responded to my own requests, to single them out to be bothered by other fundraisers, so I also refused to give him such a list. He then asked if I would at least give me some advice. "That I'll gladly do," I said. "First, I advise you to ask everyone you know will give something. Next, ask those you're not sure about and show them the list of people who have already given. And finally, don't ignore those you're sure won't give anything, because you might be wrong about some of them." He laughed and thanked me, saying he would follow my advice. And he did. He asked everyone, and he got much more money than he expected, which he used to build the large and very fancy church that's now on Ark Street.
Even though our city was beautifully planned with wide, straight streets that crossed at right angles, it was a shame that these streets stayed unpaved for so long. In wet weather, heavy carriage wheels would churn them into a muddy mess, making them hard to cross. And in dry weather, the dust was really annoying. I lived near what was called the Jersey Market and was pained to see people wading through mud just to buy their groceries. Eventually, a strip of ground down the middle of that market was paved with brick, so once people were in the market, they had solid ground. But they often had to walk through ankle-deep dirt just to get there.
By talking and writing about it, I eventually helped get the street paved with stone between the market and the brick sidewalks that ran along the houses on each side. For a while, this made it easy to get to the market without getting your feet wet. But since the rest of the street wasn't paved, whenever a carriage came off the muddy part onto this paved section, it would shake off and leave its dirt, and the pavement would soon be covered in mud. The city didn't have street cleaners yet, so it just stayed there. After some searching, I found a poor, hard-working man who was willing to keep the pavement clean by sweeping it twice a week and taking away the dirt from in front of all the neighbors' doors. He charged 6 pence per month per house. I then wrote and printed a paper explaining the benefits this small expense would bring to the neighborhood. It would be easier to keep our houses clean since less dirt would be tracked in. Shops would get more customers because buyers could reach them more easily and their goods wouldn't get covered in dust on windy days, and so on. I sent one of these papers to each house, and a day or two later I went around to see who would sign an agreement to pay the 6 pences. Everyone signed, and for a while it worked well. All the city residents were thrilled with how clean the market pavement was, as it benefited everyone. This created a general desire to have all the streets paved, and made people more willing to accept a tax for that purpose. After some time, I drafted a bill for paving the city and brought it to the Assembly. This was just before I left for England in 1757. It didn't pass until I was gone, and then it included a change in how the tax was assessed, which I didn't think was an improvement. However, it also added a provision for lighting the streets as well as paving them, which was a big step forward. It was a private citizen, the late Mr. John Clifton, who first gave people the idea of lighting the whole city by putting a lamp at his own door. The credit for this public improvement has also been given to me, but it truly belongs to him. I just followed his example. My only real contribution was to the design of our lamps, which were different from the globe lamps we first got from London. We found those inconvenient because they didn't let air in from below, so the smoke didn't easily go out the top. Instead, it circulated inside the globe, settled on the inner surface, and quickly blocked the light they were supposed to provide. Plus, they needed to be wiped clean every day, and one accidental bump would smash them, making them completely useless. So I suggested making them with 4 flat panes of glass, with a long funnel on top to draw up the smoke, and small openings below to let in air, helping the smoke rise. This way they stayed clean and didn't get dark in just a few hours like the London lamps did. They stayed bright until morning, and an accidental bump would usually only break one pane, which was easy to fix.
I've sometimes wondered why Londoners didn't learn from the holes in the bottom of the globe lamps at Vauxhall, which kept them clean, and put similar holes in their street lamps. But those holes were actually for a different purpose, to quickly light the wick with a bit of flax hanging through them. The idea of using them to let in air doesn't seem to have occurred to anyone. That's why, after the lamps have been lit for just a few hours, London streets are very dimly lit. Talking about these improvements reminds me of a suggestion I made in London to Dr. Fothergill, who was one of the best men I've known and a big supporter of useful projects. I had noticed that when the streets were dry, they were never swept, and the light dust wasn't removed. Instead, it was allowed to build up until wet weather turned it into mud. Then, after lying so deep on the pavement for days that you could only cross on paths kept clean by poor people with brooms, it was laboriously raked together and shoveled into open-top carts. The sides of these carts would let some of the slush spill out with every bump on the pavement, sometimes bothering pedestrians. The reason given for not sweeping the dusty streets was that the dust would fly into shop and house windows. A chance event showed me how much sweeping could be done in a short time. One morning, at my door on Craven Street, I found a poor woman sweeping my pavement with a birch broom. She looked very pale and weak, as if she had just recovered from an illness. I asked who hired her to sweep there. She said, "Nobody, but I'm very poor and in need, and I sweep in front of gentlefolks' doors, hoping they'll give me something." I told her to sweep the whole street clean, and I'd give her a shilling. This was at 9 o'clock. At noon, she came for the shilling. Given how slowly she seemed to be working at first, I could hardly believe the job was done so quickly. I sent my servant to check, and he reported that the entire street was perfectly clean, with all the dust placed in the gutter in the middle. The next rain washed it all away, leaving the pavement and even the drain perfectly clean. I then figured that if that weak woman could sweep such a street in 3 hours, a strong, active man could do it in half the time. And here, let me point out how convenient it is to have only one gutter in such a narrow street running down the middle, instead of two, one on each side near the sidewalk. When all the rain that falls on a street runs from the sides and meets in the middle, it creates a current strong enough to wash away all the mud it encounters. But when divided into two channels, it's often too weak to clean either, and only makes the mud it finds more liquid, so that carriage wheels and horse hooves splash it onto the sidewalk, making it dirty and slippery, and sometimes splashing people walking by. My proposal, which I shared with the good doctor, was as follows. To clean and keep clean the streets of London and Westminster more effectively, I propose that the various watchmen be hired to sweep up the dust in dry seasons and rake up the mud at other times, each in the streets and lanes of their patrol area. They should be given brooms and other suitable tools for these tasks, to be kept at their posts, ready to give to the poor people they might hire for the job. Also, in the dry summer months, all the dust should be swept into piles at regular intervals before shops and house windows usually open, at which point the street cleaners with covered carts will also take it all away. And when the mud is raked up, it shouldn't be left in piles to be spread around again by carriage wheels and horses. Instead, the street cleaners should be given cart bodies that aren't placed high on wheels, but low on runners with slatted bottoms. These, covered with straw,
will hold the mud thrown into them and allow the water to drain out, making it much lighter as water makes up most of its weight. These cart bodies should be placed at convenient distances and the mud brought to them in wheelbarrows. They should stay where they are until the mud has drained, and then horses can be brought to pull them away.
I've since had doubts about whether the latter part of this proposal is practical, because some streets are so narrow, and it would be hard to place the draining sleds without blocking the way too much. But I still believe that the first part, requiring the dust to be swept up and carried away before shops open, is very doable in the summer when the days are long. For example, walking through the Strand and Fleet Street one morning at 7 o'clock, I noticed not a single shop was open, even though it had been daylight and the sun had been up for over 3 hours. The people of London choose to live a lot by candlelight and sleep through the sunshine, yet they often complain, a bit ridiculously, about the tax on candles and the high price of tallow. Some might think these small matters aren't worth bothering with or talking about. But when they consider that even though dust blowing into one person's eyes or into one shop on a windy day isn't a big deal, the sheer number of times it happens in a busy city, and how often it repeats, gives it importance. Perhaps then they won't criticize too harshly those who pay attention to these seemingly minor issues. Human happiness comes not so much from big strokes of luck that rarely happen, but from the small advantages that occur every day. So if you teach a poor young man how to shave himself and keep his razor sharp, you might contribute more to his happiness than by giving him 1,000 guineas. The money might be quickly spent, leaving only regret for having wasted it. But in the other case, he avoids the frequent annoyance of waiting for barbers and their sometimes dirty fingers, bad breath, and dull razors. He shaves when it's most convenient for him and enjoys the daily pleasure of doing it with a good tool. With these thoughts, I've risked writing these few pages, hoping they might offer ideas that could someday be useful to a city I love, having lived there very happily for many years, and perhaps to some of our towns in America. For some time, I had been working for the Postmaster General of America as his comptroller, organizing various offices and making sure the officers were accountable. When he died in 1753, I was appointed, along with Mr. William Hunter, to take over his role by an official order from the Postmaster General in England. The American Post Office had never before sent any money to the British one. We were supposed to get £600 a year between us if we could make that much from the office's profits. To do this, we needed to make a lot of improvements. Some of these were expensive at first, so in the first 4 years, the office actually owed us over £900. But soon after, it started paying us back, and before I was removed from the job due to a whim of the ministers, which I'll talk about later, we had made it generate as much clear profit for the Crown as the post office in Ireland. Since that foolish decision, they haven't received a single penny from it. My work with the post office led me to travel to New England this year, where Cambridge College, on their own initiative, gave me a Master of Arts degree. Yale College in Connecticut had already given me a similar honor. So, without ever attending college, I got to share in their academic honors. They were given to me because of my advancements and discoveries in the field of electrical natural philosophy.